The first evening Amos Ridley saw her, the wind had been carrying dust low across the pasture, thin as flour and restless as breath. It slipped over the cracked caliche road, whispered through the dry grass around the old stone well, and gathered in little gold-colored drifts against the chicken wire fence behind his house. The sun had not gone down yet, but it had lowered enough to turn every cedar tree black at the edges, and the whole yard looked as if it had been holding its breath all day. Amos had come out with a tin dipper in one hand and a feed sack folded under his arm, moving with the careful stiffness of a man who had spent too many years lifting things alone. He was 67, broad in the shoulders but narrowed by grief, with a beard gone mostly white and one knee that complained whenever the weather turned. He had meant only to check the well cover before nightfall. Then he saw the bobcat. She was crouched beside the stone ring, not waiting like a pet and not hiding well enough to be unseen. Her body was low, her spotted coat dulled by dust, her ribs faintly visible when the wind pressed the fur flat along her side. One torn ear leaned at a slight angle, and her pale muzzle made her look older than she probably was. She did not run. That was the first thing that troubled him. A wild bobcat should have vanished into the cedar line before a man crossed half the yard. Amos stopped so suddenly that the tin dipper tapped against his thigh. "Well," he murmured, though there was no one there to answer him. The bobcat's amber eyes fixed on him, not soft eyes, not grateful eyes, watchful ones, measuring ones. She shifted her weight, lifted her right front paw, and set it down again with a tiny tap against the hard-packed earth. It was such a small motion that another man might have missed it. Amos did not. He had spent too many years watching weather, livestock, and silence. He knew when a living thing was trying to decide whether the world still meant harm. The old well stood 20 yards from the porch, built by Amos's grandfather from limestone hauled up from the creek bed, back when there had been more water and fewer fences. It had a round wooden cover now, gray with age, and an iron handle worn smooth by family hands. His wife, Lorna, had once hung a little blue glass charm from the handle because she said water deserved something pretty watching over it. The charm still clicked there whenever the wind came from the west. That evening, it clicked once. Amos lowered the dipper very slowly. The sensible thing would have been to go back inside, call the county wildlife office, and let someone trained handle whatever had brought a bobcat this close to a house. He knew that. He had lived his whole life in Briscoe County and had never confused wildness with neediness. Bobcats belonged in ravines, brush pockets, rocky draws, and moonlit fence rows. They did not belong beside a widower's well at supper time. But thirst had its own language. On the porch rail sat the enamel pan he used for rinsing garden onions. Amos turned toward it, keeping his movements quiet, and the bobcat's ears flattened. She did not hiss, she did not bolt. She only watched the bend of his elbow, the shift of his boots, the dipper in his hand. Her tail, short and dark-tipped, gave one sharp twitch. The chickens behind the wire had noticed by then. They stood in a ridiculous line near their coop door, all 7 of them silent for once, their little heads tilting as if they had been called to a meeting. Amos almost smiled, despite the tightness in his chest. "Don't flatter yourselves," he whispered. "She's not here for conversation." The sound of his own voice felt strange in the yard. Since Lorna had passed 2 winters earlier, the house had become a place of small noises, the ticking kitchen clock, the scrape of his chair, the kettle beginning to sing before dawn. He still set 2 mugs out some mornings, before remembering. One was his chipped brown coffee mug. The other, blue with faded paint near the handle, stayed on the shelf unless he forgot himself. He had not expected anything to need him again. That was the thought that moved through him as he filled the onion pan halfway from the spigot by the porch. Not hope, not yet. Just the ache of being useful for one small minute. He carried the pan down the steps. The middle step gave its familiar crack under his left boot, and the bobcat's head lifted at the sound. Amos froze. The chickens froze too, which made the whole yard seem foolishly formal, like every creature had been asked to stand still for a photograph. "Easy," he said. He did not go toward her. Instead, he set the pan on the ground near the porch and backed away. Too close, he decided. A thirsty wildcat would not come that near a man's shadow. So he picked it up again, slow as sunrise, walked 5 steps sideways, and placed it near the low fence post where Lorna's morning glories used to climb. Still not close to the well, still not close to the bobcat, but closer to the open yard than to him. The bobcat did not move. A soft invitation belonged there more than a loud one, the kind Amos himself would have trusted. If this quiet story touched anyone listening, they could leave a gentle like, subscribe if they wished, and tell the community where they were watching from, along with the name of an animal that had once left a mark on their heart. Then the yard settled again. The sun slipped another inch behind the cedar ridge. Heat rose from the stones around the well. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a mourning dove gave its tired, hollow call. The bobcat blinked once slowly, but not in trust, in exhaustion. Amos eased back onto the porch and sat in the wooden chair closest to the door. It had been Lorna's chair. He still avoided it most days without thinking, choosing the harder one beside it. But that evening he sat there because it was farther from the pan, and because the bobcat needed distance more than he needed comfort. A fly landed on the rim of the pan, walked boldly along it, and lifted away. One chicken made a small offended sound, as if she had remembered she was supposed to be dramatic. Amos kept his hands folded on his knees. He tried not to stare directly. He looked instead at the well stones, at the blue charm, at the strip of pale dust between the animal and the water. The bobcat rose at last, not fully, not proudly. She lifted herself in pieces, hindquarters first, then shoulders, then head. She stood thin and dusty in the last light, a wild thing reduced by summer, but not emptied of dignity. Her torn left ear caught the sun. Her right paw tapped once before she stepped. Amos felt that tap somewhere deep in himself. She came no closer than 10 feet from the pan before stopping. Her nose tested the air. Her whiskers, one side shorter than the other, trembled. She looked at Amos. She looked at the chickens. She looked toward the cedar line, where escape waited in shadow. Then she turned away. Amos let out a breath he had not known he was holding, but she did not leave. She circled once around the well, slow and uneven, keeping the stone wall between herself and the porch. At the far side she crouched again, facing him through the dimming air. Her eyes shone, not with magic, but with the simple brightness of a creature still deciding to live. Amos stayed until the first stars appeared. When he finally rose, the pan remained untouched. The bobcat had slipped back into the cedar scrub without a sound, leaving only a faint oval print in the dust beside the well. He walked down after she was gone and looked at it for a long while. One paw mark, one sign that she had truly been there. He did not know then that the print was not an ending. He did not know that before the season turned, the same well would hold more than one shadow at dusk. He only knew that something wild and hurting had come close to his loneliness, and that for the first time in many months, he found himself setting out water before he went to bed. By morning, the pan was empty. Amos found it while the sky was still pale, and the house smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dust warmed by the first breath of day. He had woken before the alarm, as he often did now, lying beneath the thin summer sheet, listening for a voice no longer in the kitchen. The habit of waiting had not left him. Grief, he had learned, was not always a storm. Some days it was only the shape of the quiet beside him. He carried his chipped brown mug outside and stood on the porch in his socks, forgetting his boots until the rough boards reminded him. The enamel pan sat near the old morning glory post, tilted slightly, with a crescent of mud dried along one edge where a tongue or paw had disturbed the dust. Beside it were prints. Not many. A bobcat did not waste steps. 4 clear ones crossed from the cedar line, paused at the water, and angled back toward the well before disappearing into grass stiffened by drought. Amos crouched as far as his knee allowed. "Well now," he said softly. The words were not excitement, not exactly. They were more like the sound a man made when a locked room in his heart opened a crack without asking permission. His land lay 12 miles outside Silverthread, a town small enough that people still knew which mailbox belonged to which sorrow. The Ridley place had once held 2 milk cows, peach trees, a garden, and Lorna's fierce belief that dry country could be coaxed into kindness. In August, the fields smelled of hot cedar, chicken feed, and sun-baked stone. In winter, blue northers came flat across the land and rattled every loose hinge on the house. The well remained through all of it, older than the barn, older than the county road, older than Amos's memories of being small and sent out with a bucket. He had been a pump mechanic before retirement, a man who could listen to a motor cough and tell whether it needed a belt, a bearing, or patience. Farmers called when wells failed, windmills clanked wrong, or a pump house groaned at midnight. His hands had fixed water for half the county, yet after Lorna died, he forgot to drink enough himself. That was one of the quiet jokes she would have scolded him for. He could almost hear her from the kitchen window. "Amos Ridley, you can rebuild a pump blindfolded and still lose your own glass of water." The thought made his mouth move toward a smile before it became something softer. The house behind him was a low white farmhouse with green trim fading under the sun. Lorna had painted the trim herself one spring, climbing the ladder even after Amos told her he would do it. She had been 5'3", stubborn as a fence post, and tender in ways she tried to hide. She rescued moths from lampshades, fed tomato hornworms to the chickens with grave ceremony, and named tools if they broke more than twice. The old wheelbarrow was Arthur. The leaky kettle was Miss June. Amos's left boot, after a sole repair went badly, was the dramatic one. After she was gone, he stopped correcting those names. He still leaned Arthur by the shed. He still told Miss June to settle down when she hissed on the stove. Some habits stayed, because losing them felt like losing her again. His mornings had become orderly. Feed the chickens, check the well cover, sweep the porch though no one tracked in but him, walk the fence line if his knee allowed, heat beans or eggs before the house became too hot, mend something that did not urgently need mending. At dusk, sit outside until the light left the stones. Neighbors thought he preferred being alone. It was easier to let them think that. There was a difference between choosing solitude and having it handed to a man in a hospital room under fluorescent lights. Amos had never found a polite way to explain that. His nearest neighbor, Calvin Pike, came by every other Saturday with feed or gossip, usually both. Once Calvin had invited him to town for dominoes, and Amos had answered that fish did not deserve to hear old men lie about them. Calvin laughed hard enough to scare a hen off the porch rail, and for a minute the yard had sounded almost like it used to. There were small mercies like that. A hen named Biscuit, who insisted on laying eggs in a flower pot instead of the nesting box. A gecko behind the porch lantern that appeared each evening with the dignity of a tiny landlord. The blue glass charm on the well handle, clicking even when Amos forgot to listen. Warmth had not vanished from the world. It had only become quieter, more easily missed. That morning, however, the empty pan changed the shape of his routine. Amos washed it carefully, at the spigot, though it was only dust and dried mud. He filled it again, carried it farther from the porch than before, and set it where the yard sloped toward the well. Not too close to the house, not too close to the stone ring, a place between. He added nothing else, no scraps, no foolish attempt to lure, only water. Then he called the county office from the kitchen phone. Maribel Kane answered on the third ring. She was the wildlife ranger for that stretch of county, younger than Amos by nearly 30 years, with a calm voice that made people confess things in proper order. She listened while he described the bobcat, the torn left ear, the thin body, the empty pan, the tracks. "Don't approach her," Maribel said. "Don't try to touch her. Keep chickens secured. Water is all right in this heat if she's already coming in. I'll drive out when I can and look at the area." "I know better than to grab a wildcat," Amos said. "I figured you did. Still have to say it. That your official voice?" "It's my please don't make paperwork for me voice." For the first time that morning, Amos chuckled. After he hung up, he stood beside the kitchen table. The house felt no less empty. The chair across from him was still unoccupied. The hallway still held the hush of rooms unused. But outside, beyond the screen door, the well stones waited in the light. And somewhere in the cedar scrub, a torn-eared bobcat knew there was water on Amos Ridley's dry acres. The bobcat returned on the third evening, when the heat had begun to lift from the ground, but had not yet left the stones. Amos had been pretending not to wait for her. He spent the afternoon doing small jobs badly. He tightened the hinge on the shed door and left it squeaking worse than before. He sorted a coffee can of old screws, found 3 washers he had been looking for since spring, then forgot why he had needed them. He swept the porch twice, though the west wind kept bringing dust back as if it had a personal disagreement with order. By 6 o'clock, the chickens had put themselves in a loose half-circle beneath the chinaberry tree, each bird tucked into her own patch of shade. Biscuit, the most unreasonable hen on the place, had climbed into the empty flower pot again, and sat there with the proud misery of a queen in exile. "You got a whole coop," Amos told her. Biscuit blinked at him as if that was exactly the problem. He had placed the water pan where Maribel had suggested when she stopped by earlier that afternoon, out in the open, away from the chicken wire, and far enough from the porch that a wild animal would not feel cornered. Maribel had walked the yard with her hat pulled low and her boots leaving clean marks in the powdery dust. She had found the tracks by the well and crouched over them without touching. "Female," she had said, "not very big. Maybe stressed, maybe nursing at some point, though I can't say from prints alone." The word nursing had stayed with Amos after she left. He did not know why. Maybe because it made the animal less like an intruder and more like a life with hidden burdens. Maybe because Lorna had always said mothers, whether feathered, furred, or human, carried weather inside them that no one else could see. Now, Amos sat on the porch with his brown mug empty beside him and a small plate of untouched toast on his knee. He had made supper, if toast counted as supper, then forgotten to eat it while watching the cedar line. The first sign was not movement. It was silence. The doves stopped calling. The grasshoppers seemed to lower their fiddling. Even the chickens, who considered quiet a personal insult, grew still beneath the tree. Then the bobcat stepped out from between 2 cedar trunks. She did not appear all at once. First came the pale muzzle, dusty and narrow, then one amber eye, then the torn left ear with its ragged edge bent slightly back. Her coat blended so closely with the dry grass and mottled shade that Amos understood how many wild things must have watched him over the years without his ever knowing. She froze with one paw lifted. The evening smelled of hot stone, chicken dust, and the faint mineral dampness that rose from the old well when the air cooled. A strand of Lorna's blue glass charm clicked softly against the iron handle. The bobcat's eyes flicked toward it, sharp and quick. Her lifted paw tapped once when it touched earth. There it was again, that tiny testing motion. Amos had seen horses paw before crossing a trailer ramp, Dogs hesitate at a slick floor. Calves place their feet wide on new ground. But the bobcat's tap was different. It was not clumsy. It was precise, almost private, as if she were asking the earth whether it could be trusted to hold her. She took 2 steps into the yard, then slipped sideways behind a clump of broomweed. Amos looked down at his toast because direct attention felt like pressure. The toast had cooled into a hard little square. Lorna would have made a face at it. She had believed toast needed butter right to the corners, not the careless scrape Amos gave it. He broke off a dry edge and set it on the porch rail. A gecko emerged from behind the lantern, stared at it, then retreated in disappointment. "Fair judgment," Amos whispered. The bobcat's ears turned toward his voice. He stopped speaking. She moved again, low and quiet. Her tail twitched once, black tip cutting the air. When she crossed a bright patch of dust, Amos saw more of her. She had a narrow scar over the bridge of her nose, healed long ago into a pale line beneath the fur. One side of her whiskers looked shorter, as though singed or broken. Her left flank rose and fell a little too quickly. Not dying, he thought. Not well, either. That space between those 2 truths hurt him more than he expected. She reached the well and circled it halfway, placing the stones between herself and the porch, exactly as she had before. She sniffed at the base where old moisture darkened the dust, then turned her head toward the water pan. It sat 12 feet away, shining dull silver in the low sun. The chickens noticed her fully then. Biscuit gave one soft, scandalized cluck from the flower pot. Another hen, Dot, stretched her neck so far she nearly tipped forward. The bobcat looked at them, and every bird remembered urgent business inside the coop. They hurried away in a rustling, feathered panic that would have been funny if Amos had not been concentrating so hard on staying still. The bobcat did not chase. That mattered. She watched the chickens vanish, then looked back at the pan. Amos felt a strange, tender embarrassment for everyone involved. The chickens for their drama, the bobcat for her hunger, himself for sitting there with old toast and a heart that had begun beating too carefully. The bobcat approached the water in a crooked line, never straight, never careless. She paused at each pocket of shadow, tasting the air. Once a moth lifted from the grass and brushed near her face. She jerked back, then seemed almost annoyed with herself. Her ears flattened for one breath before rising again. At 6 feet from the pan, she stopped. Amos lowered his eyes. The porch board beneath his left heel creaked. The bobcat sprang backwards so quickly that dust puffed around her legs. She did not run to the cedars. She only retreated to the well, body pressed low against the stone ring. Amos closed his eyes for a moment. "Sorry," he breathed, too softly to carry. When he opened them, she was still there. A long minute passed, then another. The blue charm clicked. This time, she did not flinch. She stared at Amos, as if memorizing the shape of him. The white beard, the worn suspenders, the still hands, the bad knee, stretched carefully in front of him. He wondered what she saw. Not kindness, surely. Not yet. Maybe only a man-shaped risk that had not moved toward her. At last, she lowered her head to the pan. She did not drink. She sniffed the rim, touched it once with her nose, then drew back and looked toward the cedar line. Her paw tapped. Once, twice. Then she turned and slipped away without a sound. The pan remained full. Amos sat until the porch shadows joined the yard shadows, and the first bat stitched itself across the purple air. Disappointment came, but it was gentler than he expected. She had come farther. She had studied the water. She had not fled at the sight of him. For a wild creature, that was not nothing. Inside, Amos placed his uneaten toast in a scrap bowl and washed his mug. Before bed, he stood at the kitchen window and looked toward the well. The moon had risen enough to silver the stone rim. Near the water pan, almost too faint to see, were 4 fresh prints in the dust. She had left him no trust, but she had left proof that fear had paused. For the next week, Amos learned to measure mercy in feet, not in grand gestures, not in brave steps forward, not in any of the things people like to tell stories about later, when danger had become memory and fear had been softened into meaning. Mercy, for that bobcat, was 3 feet more space than Amos thought necessary. He moved the water pan a little each morning, not closer to the porch, but closer to the path she had chosen for herself. The place she seemed willing to consider was neither his yard nor the wild brush. It was the thin strip between them, where dust held tracks until the wind erased them, and the well stones gave off the night's last coolness before sunrise. Maribel had returned once, just long enough to study the tracks, check the chicken fence, and remind Amos that helping did not mean feeding a wildcat into dependence. "Water in this heat is one thing," she said. "Food is different. If she's injured or raising young, scraps might keep her near trouble. Use judgment. Small, rare, no handouts from the porch." Amos had nodded. "I'm not looking to make a house cat out of her." Maribel looked toward the cedar line. "Good, because she'd be terrible at it." That made Amos laugh quietly. The thought of that stern, amber-eyed creature allowing a collar, a couch, or a name spoken too often was so absurd that even Biscuit seemed to cluck in agreement from her flower pot. Still, on the 5th evening, Amos set out a small bit of cooked chicken left from his own supper. Not much. A few plain pieces, no bones, no seasoning, placed on a flat stone well away from the house and away from the chicken run. He did it with the solemn care of a man leaving a note he was not sure should be answered. The air smelled of warm dust and boiled coffee. Cicadas buzzed in the mesquite until the whole yard seemed to vibrate. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, and the old blue charm on the well handle turned dark as a raindrop. Amos set the food down, then backed away until his boots touched the first porch step. The middle step cracked beneath him. Out by the cedar line, something stopped moving. He could not see her yet, but he felt her attention arrive. It changed the yard the way a cloud changed light. Amos sat in the harder chair that evening, leaving Lorna's chair empty beside him. He had begun speaking less when the bobcat came, not because silence was more dramatic, but because silence seemed to be the only language she did not distrust. He rested his hands on his knees, his fingers curled around nothing. She emerged after nearly 20 minutes. As before, she appeared in pieces. Pale muzzle, torn left ear, shoulders low under spotted fur. Then the whole narrow body, thinner than it ought to be, moving with that careful side-winding path that kept every escape route open. Her right paw tapped before she stepped into the yard. Amos watched, without watching too hard. The bobcat circled the well once, then twice. She stopped at the water pan, lowered her head, and drank. That alone filled something in him he did not want to name. Her tongue touched the water quickly, neatly, with small pauses between each drink. Now and then she lifted her head and looked straight at him, drops darkening the pale fur beneath her chin. A tiny breeze came across the pasture and carried the scent of the chicken pieces. She froze. Her whiskers angled forward. Her ears shifted, one whole, one torn. She looked toward the stone, then toward Amos, then toward the chickens, who had gathered inside the run with the intense interest of neighbors behind curtains. Dot gave a single cluck. The bobcats stared. Dot reconsidered every decision in her life and stepped behind the feeder. Amos pressed his lips together to keep from smiling. The bobcat approached the food in a wide curve. At 5 feet, she stopped and tapped her paw. At 3, she lowered her body. At 1, She stretched her neck as far as she could without committing the rest of herself, as if the flat stone might suddenly reveal a trapdoor. Then she took one piece and leapt backward. Dust puffed. She chewed in the shadow of the well, eyes never leaving Amos. The sight was not sweet in the usual way. It was too cautious for that, too edged with hunger and memory. But it moved him more than sweetness would have. She had accepted only what she could carry away from him. She had trusted the food, perhaps, but not the giver. Amos had spent 2 years wishing grief could be rushed into something gentler. People had tried. They brought casseroles, invitations, advice, church bulletins folded around sympathy. He knew they meant well. He loved them for meaning well. But sometimes kindness had come too close, too loudly, with both hands reaching. Sometimes what he had needed was exactly what the bobcat needed now. A little water, a little distance, no one asking him to become tame before he was ready. The bobcat finished the first piece and returned for the second, this time without jumping quite as far back. Her right paw still tapped, her tail still twitched. When a grasshopper sprang near the stone, she startled, then pinned it beneath one paw with such offended precision that Amos let out one soft breath of laughter. She looked at him sharply. He lowered his eyes, apologizing with silence. A few minutes later, she did something new. After eating, she moved to the pan again and drank with her side turned partly toward him. Not her back, never that. But not full face either. It was the smallest compromise, the kind only a lonely man sitting still in a dusty yard would have noticed. Amos noticed. The evening cooled. The porch lantern behind him glowed faintly, though he had not meant to turn it on so early. Moths began gathering around the glass. The gecko appeared, claimed its usual place, and looked deeply satisfied with the buffet of foolish insects arriving for supper. "You and me both," Amos whispered, before he could stop himself. The bobcat's ear turned, but she did not run. That was the second warmth of the evening. The third came when Biscuit, apparently insulted by being ignored, marched out of the coop and halfway across the run, with a piece of straw stuck to her back like a royal banner. The bobcat watched her through the wire. Biscuit watched back. Neither moved. It was, in its own small way, the most serious negotiation on the Ridley place since Maribel had told Amos to stop using baling twine for permanent repairs. At last, the bobcat turned away first. Biscuit scratched the dirt once, victorious. Amos shook his head. The bobcat slipped toward the cedar line, then paused beside the well. She looked at the pan, at the flat stone, at Amos. Her body remained angled toward escape. Her eyes remained wild. But she did not vanish immediately. Her paw tapped once in the dust. Then she was gone. Amos waited until full dark before collecting the empty stone. He did not call after her. He did not give her a name. He did not tell himself she would return. He only washed the pan, set it upside down by the sink, and placed 3 plain pieces of chicken in the icebox for another evening, though he knew Maribel would tell him not to make a habit of it. Outside, the well charm clicked once in the warm dark. Amos stood at the screen door and listened. For the first time in a long while, the quiet around the house did not feel empty. It felt occupied by possibility. The first real drink happened on an evening that looked too ordinary to keep. The sky lowered itself into a soft copper color, and the heat loosened from the yard, one breath at a time. Amos had spent the day replacing a cracked washer on the spigot by the porch, and the smell of old rubber, wet metal, and sun-warmed limestone still clung to his hands. He had filled the pan at dusk and carried it to the place near the well, where the bobcat had begun to expect it. Expect was not trust. Amos knew the difference. Expectation belonged to habit, Trust required a creature to risk being wrong. He set the pan down, backed away, and sat on the porch with his bad knees stretched in front of him. The middle step had cracked under his boot again, loud as a snapped twig. He made a mental note to fix it, the same note he had made for 6 months. Lorna would have said the step was not broken, only expressing itself. The bobcat appeared before the sun fully slipped. This time Amos did not see her come out of the cedar line. He only looked up and found her already standing beside the well, half hidden by the stone rim, as if the dry country had shaped her from shadow and dust. Her torn left ear caught a line of orange light. The pale scar on her nose seemed softer at that hour. Her amber eyes held him without blinking. Her right paw tapped once. Amos did not speak. The chickens had learned the rhythm too, though not with grace. Dot and Pearl went inside the coop at once, pretending it had been their plan all along. Biscuit remained in her flower pot, round and defiant, until the bobcat looked her way. Then Biscuit lowered herself very slowly, as if invisibility might be achieved through dignity. The bobcat circled the well one time, nose low, reading the night's old messages in the dust. She paused where the pan had sat the evening before, sniffed the empty space, then moved toward the fresh water. She did not approach directly. She never did. Her path curved like a question. Every few steps, she stopped and listened with her whole body. A moth blundered into the porch lantern and ticked against the glass. The bobcat froze. Amos froze too, though he was not the one who needed to. After a moment, she continued. At the pan, she lowered her head, but instead of taking one cautious sip and retreating, she remained. Her tongue touched the water. Once, twice, then again. The sound was almost nothing, a faint lapping beneath the cicadas, but Amos heard it as clearly as if the well itself had started speaking after years of silence. She drank for a long time, not greedily, not safely. Her ears kept shifting, her shoulders stayed ready, but she stayed. Amos kept his eyes lowered to his hands. The hands looked older than they had when Lorna was alive. The knuckles were swollen from work. Once those hands had lifted hay bales, steadied ladders, held Lorna's fingers through hospital visits, and tightened bolts in the dark while rain blew sideways under a flashlight beam. Lately, they had mostly held mugs, feed scoops, and the edges of chairs. Now, they held stillness. It struck him that stillness could be a kind of work. The bobcat lifted her head, with water darkening the fur beneath her chin. A droplet clung to one short whisker on the right side, trembled there, and fell into the dust. She looked at Amos. He looked at the floorboard near his boot. The porch gecko chose that moment to dart out from behind the lantern and snatch a moth with such bold efficiency that Amos merely laughed aloud. He only breathed through his nose, but the bobcat saw the tiny movement. Her ears sharpened. The gecko vanished behind the lantern, leaving Amos looking guilty over a joke no one had told. "Professional fellow," he whispered before he could stop himself. The bobcat did not run. Her ear turned toward the sound. Her body stiffened, but her paws stayed planted. That was new. Amos felt it pass between them, no bigger than a thread. Not affection, not friendship, something quieter. The first time his voice had touched the air without sending her away. She lowered her head and drank again. He had not realized how badly he had needed one living thing to hear him and remain. The moment lasted less than a minute, but it changed the evening. The blue charm clicked against the well handle, light and hollow. A breeze moved across the yard with the smell of cedar resin and warm dust. In the chicken run, Biscuit forgot she was hiding and sneezed into the flower pot. The sound was so small and offended that Amos had to press his lips together. The bobcat looked toward the coop. Biscuit became a statue. The bobcat gave one slow blink, not toward Amos exactly, but toward the whole strange yard, with its old man, its foolish hens, its clicking charm, its dented pan of water set where a wild creature could choose it. Then she sat. Her hindquarters touched the ground near the pan, front legs straight, body still angled toward the cedar line. It was not rest, it was not comfort, but it was the first time Amos had seen her stop moving, for any reason other than fear. He did not name her aloud. A name felt too much like a hand reaching out. But in his mind, carefully, almost shyly, he began to call her Juniper, because she came from the cedar shadows and carried that same dry, sharp patience in her bones. Juniper stayed until the last sunlight left the well stones. When she finally rose, she did not leap away. She stepped back, tapped her right paw once in the dust, and looked at Amos long enough for him to understand that nothing had been promised. Then she slipped into the brush, silent and whole, and still entirely her own. Amos sat in Lorna's empty chair, without noticing he had chosen it. After dark, he walked to the pan and found it half empty, with one small wet paw print on the rim where she had steadied herself. He crouched beside it, his bad knee complaining, and touched the stone near the print without touching the print itself. Some things, he thought, were only beautiful because they could leave. The routine began so quietly that Amos almost missed the day it became one. There was no grand sign, no sudden softening in Juniper's eyes, no moment when she crossed the yard and made herself part of his life. She was too wild for that, and Amos respected her more because of it. Instead, the change arrived in small, stubborn pieces. The water pan set near the well before sundown, the porch chair turned slightly away, the chickens shut safely in the run, the blue charm clicking in the cooling air. And then, more evenings than not, Juniper came. Sometimes she appeared while the sun still burned red behind the ridge. Sometimes she waited until the yard had gone gray and the first bats flickered above the barn roof. Once she came in a misting rain that smelled of dust rising from thirsty ground. Another time, she arrived after a hot wind had blown all day, carrying a burr near her shoulder, and an expression of such cold irritation that Amos found himself whispering, "I know, ma'am. The whole county's scratchy." She paused, ears high. Then she continued to the pan. He learned not to look pleased. Pleased was too loud. By the second week, Amos had built a little shelf beside the porch door for the pan, a clean rag, and the notebook Maribel had asked him to keep. The ranger wanted dates, times, behavior, and condition. Amos wrote in careful block letters with the same carpenter's pencil he used for fence boards. August 11. Came at 7:42, drank, no food, circled well twice. Right paw tap, same as before. August 12th. Did not come. August 13th. Came after dark. Drank only when porch lamp was off. August 14th. Came before sunset. Burr on shoulder. Looked mad about it. He hesitated over that last sentence, then left it. Maribel had asked for behavior. Irritation was behavior. The house adjusted too. Amos washed his supper plate earlier, so the clatter would not carry through the screen door at dusk. He oiled the chicken gate, because its shriek startled Juniper so badly one evening that she flattened behind the well and refused to drink. He finally repaired the middle porch step, though the silence beneath his boot made him oddly sad. Lorna would have teased him for missing a broken thing. The warmth of those days came in little scenes no one else would have thought important. Biscuit abandoned the flower pot for 3 mornings, then returned with a twig stuck sideways in her tail feathers. The porch gecko began hunting from the rim of Amos's empty coffee saucer, bold and admirable. One evening, Juniper sniffed the water pan, sneezed once, and glared toward the porch, as though Amos personally controlled dust. "Complaint noted," he whispered. She did not flee. She only turned her torn ear away from him, as if refusing further discussion. That was how their companionship formed. Not by touch, not by possession, by shared territory carefully negotiated and never named too loudly. Amos never forgot what Maribel had told him. He did not feed Juniper daily. He did not leave food near the porch. He did not try to draw her closer for the pleasure of it. When he did offer a few plain scraps, he placed them far beyond the well on a flat stone near the brush, so her path always led back to cover and not toward his door. Most nights he offered only water. It surprised him how much only water could mean. In that country, water was not nothing. Water was memory, labor, inheritance, prayer. Water was his grandfather's hands stacking limestone around the well. Water was Amos, age 12, lowering a bucket while his father told him to mind the rope. Water was Lorna filling jars for cut wildflowers she insisted were not weeds if a person had the sense to admire them. Juniper understood none of that in words. Still, her behavior became familiar without becoming tame. She always approached from the north cedar line, never from the open pasture. She circled the well before drinking, sometimes once, sometimes 3 times if the wind had shifted. She disliked the porch lantern when it burned too bright, so Amos began leaving only the kitchen light on, a softer square through the screen door. She drank with her left side angled away from the house, protecting the torn ear, and when she finished, she sometimes sat for a breath with her tail wrapped close to one hind leg. Her right paw continued to tap before every uncertain step. Amos began to hear that tiny touch in his sleep. Some evenings, Calvin Pike's truck rattled down the road just when the light was turning good. Amos would step out to meet him at the gate before he could swing into the yard and ruin the quiet. "You hiding company?" Calvin asked once. "Something like that." "Lady friend?" Amos looked over his shoulder toward the well. Sharp ears, bad manners, doesn't care for dominoes. Calvin's grin softened. "You holler if you need anything." Amos nodded. "I know." But he also knew that some evenings could not be shared without breaking what made them whole. By late August, the yard had taken on a new hush at dusk. Not empty, listening. The chickens settled earlier. The gecko came out when the lantern warmed. Amos sat with his mug, sometimes coffee, sometimes only water, because Lorna's imagined scolding had finally done some good. The old well stood between the house and the cedar scrub, no longer just a family relic, but a meeting place where nothing was asked except caution and return. One night, after Juniper drank and vanished, Amos remained outside until the stars sharpened above the ridge. The blue charm swung once, catching moonlight. He thought of the first empty morning after Lorna died, when he had stood in the kitchen and believed the rest of his life would be nothing but maintenance. Feed chickens, fix hinges, pay bills, endure weather. Now he still did those things, but he also washed a dented pan as if it mattered. He wrote small notes by lamplight. He listened for a paw tap in the dust. He found himself wishing the evening would come, not because the day was lonely, but because something wild might choose, without promise, to pass near him again. That was not the same as being healed. Amos knew better than that. But it was a routine with room for breath, and for that summer, breath was enough. By September, the joy had become so quiet that Amos sometimes mistook it for weather. It arrived in the cooler edge of morning when he found Juniper's prints near the well and knew she had come after moonrise. It settled in the soft scrape of his pencil as he wrote her visits into Maribel's notebook. It showed itself in the way he began saving the cleanest water for the pan before filling his own kettle, though he would have denied giving any creature preference if asked. The afternoons were still hot, but the evenings had begun to loosen. The sky turned wider. The shadows stretched longer from the cedar trunks. A faint sweetness rose from the dry grass after sundown. Not green exactly, but almost hopeful, like the land remembering rain. Amos found himself opening the screen door earlier each day. He told himself it was for air. The chickens knew better. Biscuit had developed the habit of climbing onto the lower rail of the run just before dusk. Watching Amos carry the pan with all the stern attention of a church elder reviewing a young man's manners. If he placed it too close to the well, she clucked. If he placed it too far, she clucked again. "You supervising now?" Amos asked her one evening. Biscuit ruffled her feathers. "Lorna would have hired you." That was the first warmth of the evening, small and foolish and real enough to stay with him. Juniper came just after the porch boards cooled under Amos's boots. She stepped out of the north cedar line, paused where the shadows split, and tapped her right paw before crossing into the yard. Her torn left ear had healed into its uneven shape, and the pale muzzle no longer looked quite so drawn. She was still lean, still careful, still threaded with wild suspicion, but the sharpness of hunger had eased from her movements. She circled the well twice, always the well first. Amos had started to wonder if she trusted the stones more than him. He could not blame her. The stones did not shift, speak, reach, or hope too loudly. They simply held their place. That evening, the blue charm clicked once against the handle. Juniper looked up at it, no longer flinching. She had grown used to that small sound, just as Amos had grown used to her pauses, her sideways paths, the slow sweep of her whiskers over the rim of the pan before she drank. She lowered her head. The faint lapping sound reached him through the dusk. Amos sat with his brown mug between both hands, though the coffee inside had gone cold. The smell of it mingled with cedar dust, chicken straw, and the porch lantern's warm metal. For a moment, the whole yard seemed to fit inside one breath. The old house behind him, the well in front of him, Juniper drinking, the hen settling, the gecko waiting upside down beneath the lantern like a tiny bandit. A moth landed on Amos's sleeve. He let it stay. Juniper drank, lifted her head, then did something that made Amos forget the mug in his hands. She stepped away from the pan and moved toward the patch of soft dust where he had swept the yard that morning. She lowered herself onto one side, rolled once, and rose quickly as if embarrassed by her own comfort. Dust puffed around her spotted coat. She shook herself with offended dignity. Amos looked down at his boots and did not laugh aloud, though the effort nearly hurt. The gecko chose that same moment to miss a moth and slip halfway down the lantern glass before catching himself. Between the dusty bobcat and the startled gecko, the porch felt, for one brief second, less like a widower's house and more like a place holding little private jokes. Juniper looked toward him. He kept his mouth still. She sneezed. That was the second warmth, and it went straight through him. The third came from Pearl, the smallest hen, who had been watching from the coop doorway. When Juniper sneezed, Pearl answered with a soft chirp, not alarmed, just conversational. Juniper turned her head toward the sound. Pearl stepped backward behind Dot, as if suddenly remembering the difference between neighborliness and wisdom. Amos whispered, "Good thinking." Juniper's ear turned toward him. The joy was not that she loved him. Amos would not have dared think such a thing. The joy was that she had room enough not to be afraid every second. She could drink, she could roll in dust, she could sneeze at the earth and glare at chickens and leave when she pleased. He had once thought comfort meant holding on. Lorna had taught him otherwise in small ways, long before illness taught him the harder version. She had never cut wildflowers from the pasture unless there were many. She had never brought injured birds inside unless they could not survive the night outdoors. She had once sat beside a fallen fawn for nearly an hour, not touching it, only keeping the dogs away until the mother returned from the brush. Amos had watched her then, younger and impatient, wondering how love could sit on its hands. Now he understood a little more. Love could sit on a porch and let a bobcat remain a bobcat. Juniper began to explore the yard after drinking, never close to the house, never near the chicken fence for long. She sniffed the post where the morning glories had once climbed. She stepped over a coil of old hose, stopped, looked back at it, and jumped over it again from the other side, as if confirming it had not changed its mind. She stood beneath the chinaberry tree while dry leaves turned above her in the breeze. Once she looked directly toward Lorna's empty chair. Amos felt his chest tighten. There was no reason for that to matter. Juniper did not know chairs from memories. She did not know the woman whose hands had painted the porch trim, tied the blue charm to the well handle, and named a broken wheelbarrow Arthur. Still, Amos could not help imagining Lorna watching from the doorway, amused and gentle, telling him not to make too much of it, while making too much of it herself. The bobcat remained near the well until the first stars appeared. Then she turned toward the cedar line. At the edge of the yard, she paused and looked back. Her paw tapped once, almost hidden in the grass. It was not a farewell. It was only her way of stepping from one world into another. Amos lifted one hand, no higher than his knee. Juniper vanished. The yard did not feel empty after she left. It felt visited. Amos sat a while longer, listening to the hens murmur in the coop, and the wind move through the dry grass. When he finally stood, his knee ached, his coffee was cold, and his heart felt lighter than it had any right to feel. He carried the pan inside, washed it, and placed it on its shelf. Then he set out 2 mugs for morning, by mistake. This time, when he noticed, he did not put one away. The warning signs came soft, the way trouble often did in dry country. At first, Amos thought the change belonged to the weather. September had thinned the light, but it had not broken the heat. The afternoons still pressed down hard enough to make the porch boards smell of sun and old pine sap. The grass beyond the well had gone brittle underfoot. Juniper still came. That was why Amos did not worry at once. She appeared at dusk from the north cedar line, as she always had, and she circled the well before drinking. Her torn ears still angled toward the porch when Amos shifted in his chair. Her right paw still tapped before she crossed open ground. She still disliked the bright lantern, still ignored the newer water bowl, and still preferred the dented tin pan. "Set in your ways," he whispered one evening. From the chicken run, Biscuit made a cluck that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Juniper drank, but not for long. Then she lifted her head and looked behind her. Not toward the house, toward the cedar line. Amos followed her gaze and saw only brush darkening in the last light. A jackrabbit slipped between shadows near the fence. Wind moved through the broomweed. The blue charm clicked against the well handle. Juniper did not relax. She turned from the water and paced once around the well, then again. On the second circle, she paused at the far side and sniffed the ground with uncommon urgency, her whiskers brushing dust, her shoulders tight beneath her spotted coat. She opened her mouth slightly, tasting the air the way cats did when scent meant more than smell alone. Then she gave a low sound, not quite a growl, but deep enough that Amos felt it more than heard it. He sat forward before he remembered not to move quickly. Juniper's head snapped toward him. Amos stilled. "I'm here," he said, then regretted speaking, because the words were meant for a creature that did not need them, and for a man who did. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she slipped back into the brush without drinking again. The next morning, Amos found tracks near the well that were not hers. At least, not only hers. He had learned Juniper's prints by then, the way he knew his own handwriting. Compact, clean, measured. A slight unevenness where the right front paw landed after its testing tap. These new marks were smaller, scattered and uncertain, pressed into the dust near the cedar side of the well. They crossed over one another, doubled back, then appeared near the flat stone where he sometimes left scraps. Amos crouched until his knee objected. Small bobcat tracks, he thought. Not kitten small, not tiny, but young. His first feeling was wonder. His second was fear. Wonder rose because the hidden life behind Juniper had suddenly brushed the edge of his yard. Fear followed because young wild things meant hunger, danger, and a mother dividing herself into too many watchful pieces. Maribel's old word came back to him. Nursing. Maybe she had not been alone even then. That afternoon, Amos called Maribel and described what he had found. 9 or 10 weeks old, maybe older, she said. Could be juveniles moving with her. Don't assume too much. I counted at least 4 different small trails. No increased feeding. Water is fine. Keep distance. After he hung up, the house felt too still. Amos made a sandwich and left half of it uneaten. When he went outside, Pearl had somehow gotten a strand of hay looped over her head like a crooked necklace. Amos freed her gently while Biscuit watched with sour superiority. Everyone's got troubles, Amos told them. Pearl shook herself and looked relieved to be ordinary again. The second small warmth came when the porch gecko appeared before sunset and perched on Amos's notebook as though volunteering for official observations. Amos had to lift the pencil over its tail to write the date. You spell bobcat with 2 B's, he murmured. The gecko blinked, offering no correction. The third came from the dented pan itself. Amos had cleaned it so many times that one bright patch had begun showing through the old gray metal. He noticed it while filling the water, and thought Lorna would have called it proof that even useful things liked attention. By dusk, every sound seemed sharpened. A dry leaf skittered across the yard and made Amos turn. The chicken wire ticked as it cooled. Far off, a coyote called once, thin and lonely, and the hens went quiet. Amos kept his chair angled away from the well, but his whole body listened. Juniper arrived later than usual. She came low through the grass, not from the north cedar line this time, but from the west, where the dry wash curved behind the old shed. Her path was broken and cautious. She stopped often, looking back. Her right paw tapped, but faster now, less like testing the earth, and more like trying to steady herself. She did not circle the well. She went straight to the water, drank 3 quick mouthfuls, then lifted her head toward the west. Amos saw burrs caught along her shoulder, and dust matted near her pale muzzle. She looked leaner than she had the week before, and her breathing seemed shallow after the quick drink. She made the low sound again, not for him, but towards something hidden beyond the wash. Then from the darkening grass behind her came a small rustle. Juniper turned so sharply that Amos saw the black tip of her short tail flick like a warning. Nothing stepped out. The rustle stopped. The yard held its breath. Amos understood then that the well was no longer only a place where one thirsty bobcat came at sundown. It had become part of a larger map, one drawn in scent, caution, hunger, and need. Juniper looked at Amos once. Her amber eyes seemed brighter in the dusk, but not softer. They were alert, strained, and full of wild calculation. Then she left the pan half full and disappeared toward the west. Amos remained on the porch until darkness covered the well stones. He listened for another rustle and heard only wind. Before bed, he wrote in the notebook, September 3rd, came late, from West Wash, drank little, smaller tracks near well this morning, something wrong. He paused, pencil hovering. Then he added one more line. Do not crowd her with my worry. It was the hardest instruction he had ever given himself. The storm came without rain. All afternoon, the western sky piled itself into purple shoulders beyond the ridge. The air on the Ridley place grew so still that even the cedar branches seemed afraid to rub together. The chickens stood with wings lifted from their sides, while Biscuit hid beneath the flowerpot bench as if she had never trusted weather. Amos felt the change in his bad knee before the first thunder reached him. He had lived long enough on dry acres to know the kind of storm that looked generous from a distance and arrived with nothing but wind, light, and trouble. Dry lightning promised relief in the shape of clouds and then struck the earth without giving it a drink. By dusk, he had filled the dented pan and set it near the well. He had checked the chicken latch, moved Lorna's blue watering can, and told Arthur the wheelbarrow to behave himself against the shed wall. The joke sounded thin. A flicker opened inside the clouds. For one white second, the well stones shone bright as bone. The blue charm on the handle flashed, then vanished back into dusk. Thunder followed late, rolling low across the pasture. Juniper had not come. Amos stood at the screen door with his hand on the frame. The kitchen behind him smelled of beans cooling on the stove and coffee gone bitter in the pot. Outside, wind arrived, bending the grass flat and dragging dust into long moving sheets. The pan rattled once against a stone. Amos stepped onto the porch. "Come on, girl," he whispered, then wished he had not said it. He still rarely used the name aloud. Spoken into storm wind, it sounded too close to wanting, and wanting had never been a safe thing to place on a wild animal. Lightning flickered again, farther north. The chickens muttered inside the coop. Pearl made a worried peeping sound, and Dot answered with the weary patience of someone who had explained storms before. The porch gecko had tucked himself behind the cracked window frame, only his tiny head visible. "You've got sense," Amos told him. That was the first warmth of the evening, and it barely warmed anything. He sat in Lorna's chair because it faced the well at the right angle. The repaired middle step below him stayed quiet, and he missed its old warning crack. It had too many silences now. No paw tap, no lapping water, no soft sneeze of dust from a spotted coat rolling where she should not have felt comfortable enough to roll. A sheet of grit struck the porch screen with a dry hiss. The north trees moved as one dark mass. The west wash disappeared behind dust. Somewhere past the shed, a loose strip of tin knocked twice and fell silent. Then he saw movement near the well. His heart lifted too fast. But it was only a jackrabbit racing across the yard toward the south fence. It vanished beneath broomweed, leaving Amos with his hand half raised and his breath caught. "Fool old man," he said softly. Another flicker lit the pasture, and for that white instant he saw small tracks around the well. Older ones from the night before, already softening under wind-blown dust. He thought of the scattered young prints, the hidden rustles, Juniper's tense backward glances. A mother did not vanish without reason. She had burdens tucked in brush, dangers to read before teeth or wheels or fire. The first sharp crack of lightning struck somewhere beyond the ridge. The hens erupted in frightened murmurs. Biscuit flapped hard enough to thump the coop wall. Amos rose from the chair, one hand braced on the porch post, but there was nowhere useful to go. Maribel's voice lived in his memory. "Keep distance. Do not crowd her." So he stood there, helpless in the way patience sometimes made a person helpless. The smell came next. Not smoke, not fully, more like scorched cedar on the wind. Amos turned toward the west wash. A strike out in that dry brush could crawl low before flame showed itself. He went inside for the flashlight, then stopped at the kitchen table. The notebook lay open beside his pencil. September 4th waited on the page, blank. He wrote only one line. Storm. No sign yet. The plainness of it hurt. When he returned to the porch, the pan had tipped onto its side. Water darkened the dust before vanishing into thirsty ground. Amos watched it disappear and felt a childish anger rise in him. At the storm, at the drought, at himself for setting one pan of water in a world that needed so much more than he could carry. He stepped into the yard despite the wind. Dust stung his cheeks. He righted the pan, filled it again from the spigot, and carried it back near the well. The blue charm clicked wildly against iron. He thought of taking it down so it would not frighten her if she came. Then he left it. Juniper had learned that sound. It belonged to the well now. Maybe it belonged to her map too. Night fell unevenly, torn by lightning. Amos waited until the storm moved east and the wind lowered. He waited through the hen settling, through the gecko returning to the lantern, through the beans cooling beyond saving on the stove. Once, Pearl gave a tiny hiccuping cluck in her sleep, and Amos almost smiled. Once, Biscuit shuffled in the straw with offended importance, as if blaming him for thunder. Those were the only soft things. Juniper did not come. Near midnight, Amos walked to the well with his flashlight angled low. He only checked the pan, the ground, the stone rim. The water sat untouched, reflecting a thin strip of moon between torn clouds. Beside the well, in a place sheltered from the wind by limestone, one faint paw mark remained. Right front, the testing paw. Amos crouched slowly. The print was from before the storm. No newer tracks crossed it. No smaller prints followed. The yard smelled of wetless thunder and scorched brush. Far off, something creaked in the wind. He did not call for her. Calling would have been for him, not for her. Instead, Amos set the pan closer to the shadowed side of the well and went back to the porch with a fear he had no right to claim and no power to put down. Inside, he left the kitchen light on. All night, the old well waited, and Juniper did not return. At first light, Amos found himself dressed before the kettle boiled. He had pulled on his work shirt inside out and did not notice until he reached for his hat by the door. The mistake would have made Lorna laugh, not loudly, just that warm breath of amusement she gave when life proved a man less organized than he believed. Amos stood in the kitchen, with one sleeve seam showing and one boot unlaced, feeling the missing sound of her laughter as sharply as the smell of burnt coffee. He changed the shirt. He tied the boot. He poured the coffee out because it had gone bitter enough to punish him. Outside, the storm had left the yard rubbed raw. Dust lay in new shapes against the well stones. Bits of cedar twigs scattered across the hard ground. The dented pan still sat where he had left it, untouched, with a thin skin of grit floating on the water. No fresh tracks. Amos stood over the pan for a long minute, then washed it clean and filled it again. The morning air smelled of scorched brush and metal. Far west, beyond the shed and the dry wash, a faint gray smear hung low over the cedar ridge. Not smoke rising high, just the afterbreath of lightning on dry land. He called Maribel before 7. She answered with wind in the background. "I was about to call you. Strike west of my place? 2, maybe 3. No active fire now. I'm checking the wash road." She didn't come. Maribel was quiet for half a second. "I'll be there." While waiting, Amos fed the chickens with hands that spilled more grain than usual. Biscuit followed the falling kernels with great satisfaction, as if Amos had finally accepted her standards. Pearl stepped into the feed scoop, startled herself, and hopped backward with such delicate embarrassment that Amos almost smiled. Almost. "Not today, ladies," he murmured. The porch gecko appeared under the lantern, alive and smug after the storm. A tiny fleck of cedar bark rested on his head like a crooked hat. Amos reached up and brushed the wood from the lantern frame, careful not to touch him. "You made it through," Amos said softly. The words landed harder than he expected. Maribel arrived in her green county truck, with a coil of rope, a field pack, and her hat pulled low. She did not offer comfort before looking at the ground. Amos appreciated that. Comfort too early, could feel like someone closing a gate before the horse was found. Together they walked the yard, starting near the well. Maribel crouched beside the old paw mark, then followed the faint disturbances toward the west. Most tracks had been blurred by wind, but in the sheltered dust beneath the chinaberry tree, she found 2 small prints. "Young ones," she said. Amos swallowed. Could be from before the storm? Could be, but her voice had tightened. They moved toward the dry wash, slow and careful. Amos carried water in a canteen and a flashlight, though the sun had cleared the ridge. The wash cut behind his property in a pale, twisting scar of sand, mesquite roots, and limestone shelves. When rain came, it could run fast enough to move branches. But there had been no rain, only lightning, only fear. The ground there held stories better than the yard. Maribel pointed out signs Amos might have missed. A slide mark where something had scrambled down the bank, a cluster of small tracks beneath a mesquite, a place where Juniper's larger print overlapped the smaller ones. The right front print showed lightly ahead of the others, as if she had tapped before choosing the slope. Amos bent over it. That small habit, so familiar beside the well, nearly undid him in the wash. "She came this way," he said. Yes, the search stretched through the morning. They found no body, no blood, no sign of a struggle close enough to explain everything. In one shaded pocket beneath a cedar, they found a hollow pressed into dry grass, lined with fur and leaf dust. Maribel studied it without touching. "Temporary den," she said. "She may have moved them before the storm, or tried to." Amos looked at the hollow and imagined Juniper there in the dark, torn ear lifted, pale muzzle low, young bodies tucked against her side, while thunder moved over them. He had no right to imagine it so tenderly. He had no right to feel as if he had failed them. But the heart did not ask permission before hurting. By noon, heat climbed hard out of the wash. Cicadas began again, rough and relentless. Amos's knees stiffened on every rise. Maribel offered to continue alone, and he shook his head. "I can walk." She looked at him, then nodded. "Slow is fine." They searched beyond the old fence line, where the land dipped toward county scrub. Once a lizard shot across Amos's boot and disappeared under a rock, making him jerk so badly Maribel glanced back. For one tired second, the absurdity of it caught them both, and she gave a small smile. "Fearless rescuer," she said. "Tell no one." That was the only laugh the day allowed. Near the far bend of the wash, they found one more sign, a short whisker caught on a thorn, pale at the root and dark toward the end. Amos knew it could have belonged to any wildcat. Still, he stood looking at it while the sun pressed on the back of his neck. Maribel clipped the thorn carefully and placed it in a paper envelope from her pack, more for Amos than for science. "She knows this land better than we do," she said. "If she can move, she'll move where she thinks safest. And if she can't?" Maribel did not answer quickly. That, too, Amos appreciated. "Then we keep looking," she said. They did until late afternoon. When they returned to the house, Amos's shirt was damp, his hands scratched, and his throat dry from saying nothing. Maribel refilled the pan at the well herself and set it down exactly where Juniper expected it. "Leave the light on tonight," she said. "Not bright, just familiar." Amos nodded. After she drove away, he sat on the porch with the notebook open on his knee. He tried to write the day plainly. September 5th. Searched West Wash with Maribel. Found Den Hollow. Young tracks. One whisker. No Juniper. The pencil stopped there. He added another line after a long while. "I should have known she was carrying more than thirst." At dusk, the yard settled into its old listening shape, but without the sound it waited for. The chickens murmured themselves to sleep. The gecko hunted beneath the lantern. The blue charm clicked once, gentle as a question. Amos stayed in Lorna's chair until the stars came out. Juniper returned on the 4th night after the storm, when Amos had nearly taught himself not to look up every time the cedar line breathed. The day had been clear and cruel, No clouds, no mercy, only a pale blue sky and heat lying flat over the fields. Amos moved through his chores slowly. He fed the chickens. He washed the dented pan. He checked the well cover twice. He opened the notebook and closed it because there was nothing new to write. By sunset, he had set the water out and taken his place in Lorna's chair. He did not expect her. Expectation had become too sharp to hold. It cut him whenever the grass shifted or a night bird lifted from the fence. So he sat with his mug cooling between his palms and practiced emptiness. The yard darkened. The chickens settled early. Biscuit, who had spent the afternoon pecking at her own reflection in the watering tin, tucked herself into the coop like a hen who had discovered an enemy too evenly matched. Pearl made a soft sleep sound from the roost. Under the porch lantern, the gecko waited in his usual place, lord of every foolish moth that came near. The blue charm clicked once at the well. Amos looked up before he could stop himself. At first, there was only moonlight. It had risen nearly full, turning the limestone rings silver and laying long shadows between the broomweed clumps. The pan reflected a broken piece of sky. Beyond it, the cedar line stood black and still. Then one shadow separated from the others. Amos did not move. For a moment, his heart did not know how to beat. She looked thinner, dust-colored, and worn down to the hard center of herself. Burrs clung along her shoulder. Her torn ears seemed darker at the edge. Her pale muzzle was lowered, and her right front paw tapped once before she took another step. Alive. The word filled Amos so completely that it almost hurt. She came not from the north, not from the west wash, but from the south fence line, as if she had circled the property before allowing herself to be seen. She stopped beside the well and looked toward the porch. Her eyes were bright with the weary shine of a creature that had crossed too much dark. "Easy," Amos whispered, barely sound at all. Juniper's ears shifted. She did not run. Then the brass behind her moved. One small shape emerged near the cedar stump beyond the well. Then another. Then two more, low and hesitant, their spotted coats blurred by moonlight. They were young bobcats, long-legged, with oversized paws, alert ears, and narrow faces still holding a little softness. They moved like scattered thoughts, each wanting cover and water and mother at once. Juniper turned her head sharply, and they froze. From farther back, 5 more shapes appeared. 9. Amos counted them once, then again because his mind refused the number. 9 young bobcats stood in the silver dust beside his old well. Some were smaller than others. One had a white splash along its chest. One kept close to Juniper's hind leg. One bold little male climbed onto a low limestone slab, realized he was higher than everyone else, and immediately crouched. Another batted silently at the blue charm's shadow until Juniper gave him one look and ended the foolishness. A sound came out of Amos that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. He lowered his head before it could become either. The chickens sensed history happening and behaved badly. Biscuit muttered from inside the coop. Dot shifted on the roast. Pearl gave one curious peep, then tucked her head firmly under her wing. Juniper moved to the pan first. She drank in short, guarded sips, lifting her head between each one to watch the porch, the fence, the young ones, the night itself. When she stepped aside, she did not call them. She only turned her body slightly, and the boldest juvenile crept forward. He tapped the rim of the pan with one paw. Water trembled. He jumped backward. Amos pressed his lips together. The little one returned, stretched his neck, and drank. Soon another came, then another, until the pan was ringed by narrow faces and trembling whiskers, every one of them trying to drink without touching too much of the open world. Juniper stood between them and Amos, not threatening, not begging, simply there, a mother, making the distance herself. Amos understood why she had come thin, why she had paced, why the well had mattered. She had not been asking safety for one life. She had been testing a place large enough for 10 wild hearts to pass through. His own loneliness, which had once seemed so wide, suddenly felt small beside that. The pan emptied quickly. Amos had left a second jug by the porch. Now he lifted it slowly. Juniper's head snapped toward him. 9 young bodies scattered backward in a soft burst of dust, each finding shadow behind stone, weed, or mother. Amos froze with the jug halfway in his hand. He waited. The gecko caught a moth behind him with a tiny smack, horribly loud in the silence. Amos almost apologized to everyone. After a long minute, Juniper's right paw tapped once. She did not come closer, but she did not leave. Amos moved down the repaired porch step, one slow inch at a time. No crack warned the yard now. At the bottom, he set the jug down and rolled it gently across the dust toward the well, stopping it far short of the pan. The bull juveniles stared at the jug as if Amos had delivered a moon rock. Juniper sniffed the air. She stepped forward, tapped, then touched the plastic with her nose. It rocked slightly. One youngster leapt straight up, landed on another, and both vanished behind the well in a soundless tangle. Amos looked at his doots. The laughter inside him became warmth instead of noise. He would refill the pan later. For now, he sat in the moonlight while 9 young bobcats gathered again beside their mother, and the old well held them all in its circle of stone and silence. When Juniper finally looked at him, Amos felt no triumph, only gratitude. She had not come home. Wild things did not owe a man that word, but she had brought what she loved to the edge of his life and trusted him enough not to ruin it. By morning, Amos had not slept so much as drifted in and out of listening. Every time the house settled, he imagined small paws in the dust. Every time a cedar branch brushed the kitchen window, he saw Juniper standing between the well and moonlight, thin as a shadow and stubborn as breath. Near dawn he gave up, dressed quietly, and stepped onto the porch with coffee he forgot to drink. The yard looked ordinary in the gray light. That almost made it stranger. The well stood where it always had. The blue charm hung still from the handle. The dented pan sat empty near the stones, its rim marked with faint smudges where young mouths had crowded around it. Around the pan, the dust was written over with tracks. Juniper's measured prints, the smaller scattered ones, the sliding mark where one youngster had startled at the rolling jug. Amos crouched beside them, not touching. Even in daylight, the number felt impossible. He washed the pan, filled it, and set it back in the same place. Then he called Maribel. She arrived before sun climbed high, her truck coming slow down the Caliche road, so the engine would not startle anything that might be resting in the brush. She stepped out with binoculars, 2 collapsible water tubs, and a face that turned gentle when Amos told her what had happened. 9, she repeated. 9. And Juniper brought them here? Amos nodded toward the well. She brought them to the water, not to me. Maribel looked at him then, and he knew she had heard the difference. They spent the morning making help look like almost nothing. That was harder than it sounded. People liked help to feel active. They liked hands, ropes, cages, blankets, heroic motion. Maribel taught Amos that wildlife sometimes survived best when human kindness stayed quiet, clean, and far enough away to be refused. They placed 1 extra tub near the west side of the well and another closer to the cedar line, both low and shallow, so young bobcats would not have to crowd the pan. They used stones to steady the tubs and brushed their footprints backward with a cedar branch. Amos fixed a loose strand of chicken wire and moved the hen's feeder farther inside the run. Biscuit watched as if she were a county inspector, then dropped 1 feather into the dust with great ceremony. Permit approved, Maribel said. Amos felt a small smile move through him. Pearl tried to step into the fresh water before he carried it out, then jumped away from her own reflection. Dot scolded the bucket. The gecko, disturbed by daylight activity under his lantern, retreated into the crack by the window, like a landlord whose tenants had become noisy. Without them, Amos might have stood all morning, thinking of Juniper's ribs under her coat and the thin young shapes bending to drink. Instead, there was work. Careful work. Work with limits. Maribel walked the dry wash alone at first, then returned and let Amos come as far as the first bend. She found signs that the young bobcats had sheltered in several places after the storm, never long enough to make a true den. Juniper had been moving them, likely away from scorched brush and toward water, but the effort had worn her down. She chose well, Maribel said, looking back toward the Ridley place. Amos did not answer for a moment. The words entered him slowly. She chose well. Not the house, not him as a savior. The place, the water, the safe distance, the yard that had learned not to rush her. He thought of Lorna tying the blue charm to the handle years ago, saying the old well deserved a bit of color. He wondered what she would have made of 9 young bobcats hiding somewhere beyond the cedar line. She would have worried. She would have fussed. She would have named all 9 in secret and denied it if asked. By late afternoon, Maribel had set a small trail camera far from the house, angled toward the tubs but hidden behind brush. She explained it would help them see if all 9 were returning, if any looked too weak, and whether Juniper was moving them onward. No flash, she said, no bait. We watch and we interfere only if we have to. Amos nodded. That evening, he did not sit on the porch at first. Maribel had suggested giving the family the yard without a human shape in it. So Amos stayed inside with the kitchen light low and the screen door open. He ate beans standing at the counter, too restless for a chair. Outside, the dusk thickened. Cicadas rasped. The tubs waited near the well. The first visitor was not Juniper. A young bobcat with the white splash on its chest slipped from the cedar shadows, belly low, ears high. It moved toward the nearest tub, stopped at the smell of human hands on the stones, and backed away. Another juvenile appeared behind it, then vanished again so completely he wondered if he had imagined it. Then Juniper stepped into view. Even through the screen, Amos felt the yard change around her. She sniffed the tub, circled once, and drank. Her right paw tapped beside the stone before she shifted aside. One by one, the young ones came forward. Not all at once. Never that. 3 drank, then 2, then 4 more emerged in broken order from the grass, each with its own small fear. The bold one pawed at the tub until water splashed his face. He leapt back, offended. Another licked droplets from the stone. One crouched behind Juniper's hind leg and drank only when she lowered her head beside it. Amos stood in the dark kitchen, one hand resting on the counter. He had thought healing would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like restraint. He wanted to step out, to refill, to fix, to speak, to do more than stand there while wild lives trembled near the edge of his keeping. But he stayed still because stillness had become the only gift he could give without taking something back. After they left, he waited 10 full minutes before going outside. The tubs were half empty. Tracks crossed the dust like a secret script. Near the pan, Juniper had left one clear right front print, the testing paw. Amos bent over it beneath the first stars. "You take what you need," he whispered. "That's all." The blue charm clicked softly, as if the well had heard. The trail cameras showed them what the eye could not hold all at once. Maribel brought the memory card to Amos's kitchen 2 mornings after Juniper returned with the young ones. They sat at the table with coffee between them, the laptop balanced beside Amos's chipped brown mug, and a plate of biscuits neither of them remembered to butter. The house smelled of warm flour, old wood, and the faint dust that came through every screen, no matter how carefully Amos wiped the sills. On the screen, the well appeared in silver-gray night. At first there was nothing but the stone ring, the dented pan, and the two shallow tubs catching moonlight. Then Juniper entered from the left, thin and watchful, her torn ear unmistakable. She did not drink right away. She stood still, listening beyond the frame, then tapped her right paw once before stepping toward the water. Behind her, one young bobcat appeared, then another. Then the rest came like pieces of shadow, deciding to become real. Amos counted them silently. 9. Maribel leaned closer. All moving. Amos nodded, but his throat had tightened. The young bobcats were not babies, not helpless little things to be gathered and saved. They were nearly half-grown, each already carrying the wild in its shoulders. Still, they had a raw, unfinished look, all long legs, wide paws, and sudden starts. Their ears seemed too big for their heads. Their bodies held both caution and foolishness, the way young creatures did when the world was still explaining itself. The one with the white splash on its chest drank first whenever Juniper allowed it. Another, darker along the back, circled every tub before choosing the dented pan. One small female kept close to the cedar shadows and drank only after everyone else moved away. The bold male who had startled at the jug now appeared on camera pawing at his own reflection until water struck his nose. He leapt backward so dramatically that Maribel coughed into her sleeve. Amos looked at her. "Professional observation?" he asked. "Very professional." That became the first small warmth of the morning. They watched the clip again. The bold one returned to the tub, glared into the water, and slapped it once more, as if the mysterious wet bobcat below had insulted him twice. Amos did not laugh loudly. Even inside the kitchen, laughter felt like something that might carry too far. But his eyes softened. By then, he had begun naming them in the notebook, not as pets, never allowed in the yard, only as a way to keep track for Maribel. White chest, shadowback, little cedar, long legs, the jumper, narrow face, pale toes, last sip, and tangle, because one young bobcat managed to step over a sibling, trip on nothing, and recover with such offended dignity that Amos had recognized a whole personality in 3 seconds. Maribel saw the list and smiled. "You know those aren't official. Didn't charge the county for them. I appreciate your restraint." The second warmth came when Biscuit wandered beneath the kitchen window during the video review and pecked twice at the glass, apparently furious that an important meeting had started without her. Pearl followed, saw her reflection, and immediately stepped behind the watering can. Amos glanced toward the window. "They want representation." Maribel said, "The Hems can file a statement." The morning went on like that, softly enough to bear the worry beneath it, because worry remained. Juniper was drinking, but she still looked worn. The young ones returned in broken patterns, never all at the same time, once dawn began stretching earlier. Maribel explained that Juniper might be moving them between shelter pockets, teaching them routes, testing safer ground after the storm. The well had become one point on a map, not a home. Amos held to that. It helped and hurt at the same time. Each evening, he prepared the water as if setting a table for guests who must never be asked to stay. He rinsed the tubs with no soap, rubbed them with clean sand, filled them low, and placed them where Juniper could approach from cover. He kept the chickens shut in before dusk. He left the porch dark unless the night turned too black, and even then he used only the kitchen light. Sometimes he watched from inside. Sometimes he sat on the porch, turned away, hands folded on his knees, as he had learned to do. The young bobcats began to reveal themselves in fragments. Longlegs liked to stand on the flat limestone near the well, and look over the yard as if taking inventory. Pale Toes touched everything with one careful paw before trusting it. Last Sip always waited until the others had finished, then drank quietly from the far edge of the tub. Tangle once pounced on a dry leaf, missed, and looked around as if hoping no one had seen. Amos had seen, not because it mattered to anyone else, but because Lorna had once told him that attention was a form of thanks. If a creature passed through your life, she said, the least you could do was notice it properly. Juniper noticed everything properly. She corrected them without drama. A low sound stopped the bold one from moving too near the chicken run. One sharp look brought Little Cedar out of the open and back toward brush. When Shadowback tried to climb the well stones, Juniper stepped between him and the old wooden cover, not touching him, simply occupying the space until he changed his mind. She was not gentle the way people imagine gentleness. She was better than that. She was exact. Amos watched her and thought of all the ways love had been made too soft in stories. Real love, he was beginning to remember, often looked like vigilance, like boundaries, like keeping young bodies away from deep wells, wire fences, porch steps, and old men who cared too much. One evening, after the family had finished drinking, Juniper stayed behind. The young ones faded into the cedar shadows, one by one, until only their rustles remained. Juniper stood beside the pan with moonlight on her torn ear. She looked toward the porch. Amos sat still, barely breathing. Her right paw tapped. Then she lowered her head and drank once more, alone. It felt to Amos like seeing the weight she had hidden while they crowded around her. Not weakness, not surrender, just the brief moment after motherhood had stepped aside and thirst belonged to her again. When she finished, she looked at him for one long breath. Amos did not lift his hand. He only lowered his eyes in the old agreement between them. Take what you need, leave when you must. The blue charm clicked softly above the well. Juniper turned toward the cedar line, and the young shadows gathered around her beyond the edge of sight. Soon they were gone, but the dust beside the water was full of prints, overlapping and alive, and Amos stood there long after midnight, reading them like a letter no one had meant to send him. Through the first weeks of autumn, the Ridley place learned a new kind of household. Not a tame one, not a crowded one. No young bobcat slept on the porch. No wild mother came to Amos's hand, and no story worth keeping would have pretended otherwise. The family belonged to the cedar draws, the dry wash, and the limestone shelves only their paws understood. Still, the old well became part of their pattern, and Amos shaped his days around that quiet fact. The heat softened by degrees. Mornings arrived with a blue edge, and the grass held dew before the sun burned it away. The air smelled different now, less like scorched dust and more like cedar bark and cool stone. Every evening he rinsed the tubs, filled them low, and set them in the same careful places. Pan by the well. First tub near the west stones. Second tub close enough to the cedar line for a cautious youngster to drink with 1 foot nearly in shadow. Then he went back to the porch or inside the kitchen, depending on the wind. Juniper did not come every night anymore. At first, that frightened him. Then Maribel showed him trail camera pictures from farther down the wash. Juniper crossing a limestone shelf with 3 young ones behind her. White chest slipping under mesquite. Long legs standing on a ridge with his ears pricked toward the moon. The family was ranging wider. That was good. Maribel said it gently, but Amos heard the lesson beneath the gentleness. If they needed the well less, the well had done its job. Some nights, only 1 or 2 juveniles came. Pale Toes would appear as a careful shadow, touch the tub rim once, drink, and vanish. Last Sip often arrived after all the others, taking water from the far edge with no fuss at all. Tangle came one windy evening, pounced on a rolling cedar berry, missed it, pounced again, and finally sat on it as if that had been the plan. Amos laughed so softly the sound barely left his chest. Biscuit watched from the coop window and gave a single cluck. "Yes," Amos whispered. "You would have caught it first." That was one warmth of the new season. Another came when the porch gecko, fatter from a generous summer of moths, began appearing even in cooler weather. He would sit beneath the lantern with the grave expression of a night watchman, and Amos would nod before checking the well. "Evening, deputy." The gecko never saluted, but Amos did not hold that against him. The third warmth was smaller still. One morning, Amos found the blue charm twisted around the well handle. Before he untangled it, he noticed a juvenile print in the dust below, and beside it, a faint mark where someone had batted at the moving glass. He imagined the bold one staring up at that clicking blue spark. He suspected Juniper had scolded the youngster after. By mid-October, Amos repaired more than the step. He tightened the chicken fence, cleared dead brush near the wash, and built a low stone guard around the far side of the well cover, so curious paws could not pry near the old seams. Maribel approved, because it did not draw the animals closer. It made the place safer if they passed through. Calvin Pike came by with a sack of feed and noticed the changes. "You got yourself a project," he said. "Had a few travelers." Calvin looked at the extra tubs drying upside down in the sun, then at Amos's face. He did not pry. "Well," Calvin said, "travelers need water too." He left a spare coil of clean hose by the shed the next week without saying more. That quiet kindness touched Amos. The young bobcats grew sharper in the camera images. Their legs seemed less awkward. Their bodies lengthened. Their childish starts became quicker, cleaner decisions. They still played, but even play had purpose now. They practiced pouncing on leaves, stalking one another through broomweed, balancing on limestone, disappearing when the wind shifted wrong. Juniper watched them from the edges. She remained lean, torn-eared, exact. Sometimes she drank after them. Sometimes she did not drink at all, only inspected the area, touched her nose to a stone, and moved on. Her right paw still tapped before uncertain ground. It moved Amos every time, though he had stopped letting it break his heart. He had changed too. The house was still quiet, but it no longer sounded abandoned to him. He used both mugs now, not because he pretended Lorna would return, but because the blue one looked right on the table in morning light. He cooked proper suppers more often. He wrote longer notes in the margins of Maribel's log. October 18, cool wind. Juniper came alone, looked toward porch, drank from pan, did not hurry. October 21st, 4 young ones. Tangle less foolish but only slightly. October 24th, no visit. Stars bright, well quiet, not empty. That last line surprised him when he read it back. Well quiet, not empty. It was true of the yard. It was true of him too. One evening near the end of the month, Juniper came at sunset while Amos sat outside with his jacket collar turned up. The light was honey-colored on the stones. The chickens had gone in early. The blue charm moved lightly in the cool breeze. Juniper circled the well. Once she drank, then lifted her head and looked at Amos. Behind her, 3 young bobcats waited in the cedar shadows, nearly grown into their silence. Juniper's torn ear angled toward the porch. Her amber eyes held no softness that a stranger would have recognized. But Amos had learned to read smaller things. She did not hurry away. She let the young ones drink with him sitting there. That was enough. When they left, they moved west together, one spotted shape after another, passing through the grass as if the evening had opened a door only they could see. Juniper went last. At the cedar line, her right paw tapped once. Then she followed them into the dark. Amos remained by the porch until the first stars came out. The tubs were half empty. The well stones held the day's last warmth. Somewhere in the brush, wild lives continued without asking him to witness every step. Love, he had learned, did not always gather things closer. Sometimes it kept water ready, fixed what might harm, and watched the ones it loved grow skilled enough to disappear. The first real rain came in November, soft at the beginning and steady by nightfall. It arrived without thunder, without dry lightning, without the cruel promise of clouds that passed over empty. It simply began, tapping the porch roof in shy little notes until the dust darkened, the cedar branches bowed, and the old stone well took on the deep, clean smell Amos had known since childhood. He stood in the doorway with his brown mug in both hands and watched water run from the eaves. The chickens hated it on principle. Biscuit stepped to the edge of the coop, considered the wet yard, and backed away with theatrical disgust. Pearl tried to drink from a raindrop sliding down the wire, missed it, and looked offended by gravity. The porch gecko had disappeared for the season, though Amos still glanced toward the lantern out of habit. "Can't blame you," he murmured. "Cold night for deputies." That little joke warmed the doorway, but not enough to keep his eyes from moving toward the well. The tubs were put away now. Maribel had told him the family was ranging wider and no longer needed extra water at the Ridley place. Amos had accepted it because it was good news, and good news sometimes ached when it meant being needed less. Still, he kept the dented pan on its shelf by the porch door, not out by the well, not as bait, just near enough to remember. By dawn, the rain had passed east. The yard smelled of wet limestone, cedar needles, and clean earth waking after a long thirst. Amos pulled on his boots and walked carefully down the porch steps. The repaired middle step held firm beneath him. He still missed its old crack now and then, but less than before. Near the well, the mud held prints. Not many, not the busy gathering of 9 young bobcats crowding the water, not the frantic script of crisis or hunger. Just a few quiet marks crossing from the cedar line to the stone ring and back again. One was larger than the rest. Juniper. Amos knew before he bent close. A right front print sat a little ahead of the others, lightly pressed, as if she had still tapped the ground before trusting it. Beside it were 2 younger tracks, almost grown now. He crouched with one hand on his knee and stayed there until the cold damp reached through his jeans. The blue charm clicked above him in the morning breeze. Its glass had weathered lighter over the years, but it still gave the smallest color to the old iron handle. Juniper had come in the rain, not to ask, not to stay, only to pass through a place that had once kept water when her family needed it. Amos did not call after her. He did not wish her back loudly. He only touched the well stone, cool and rough beneath his palm, and felt a peace that was not empty at all. Winter moved over the county after that. Some nights froze the water troughs. Some mornings lifted pale fog from the wash. Amos saw Juniper only twice more before spring, both times at a distance, both times with young shapes near her, though fewer now. The 9 were becoming what they were meant to become, separate, secret, capable lives stitched into the brush. Maribel kept sending him trail camera stills when she had them. White chest on a ridge, long legs crossing the wash at midnight. Tangle, still recognizable somehow, turning his head toward the camera with one paw lifted over a puddle, as if unsure whether water could be trusted from above or below. Amos wrote under that picture in the notebook, "Still thinking too much." When spring came, the morning glories returned near the old post without being planted. Lorna would have taken credit. Amos let her. He trained the vines gently along a bit of twine, then stood back and watched the first purple bloom open toward the well. He still lived alone, but not as he once had. Calvin came more often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes with no reason except that men of his generation called loneliness checking in. Maribel stopped by when her route passed near Silverthread. The hens grew older and no wiser. Biscuit continued to treat the flower pot as private property. Pearl survived her own curiosity day after day, which Amos considered a miracle with feathers. The notebook filled slowly. Not every page was about bobcats anymore. Some pages held rain dates, repairs, chicken foolishness, notes about cedar waxwings in the chinaberry tree, and one line written on Lorna's birthday. Set out the blue mug, did not feel foolish. Years passed softly after that, not without sorrow, but without the same hollow center. Amos grew slower. His beard went fully white. His hand stiffened in the mornings, and his knee warned him of weather with increasing confidence. He hired a young man from town to mend the high fence, and accepted the help without pretending he could do everything. The well remained. So did the charm. So did the pan on the shelf, bright along one worn patch from all those washings. One evening, much later, Amos sat on the porch as sunset turned the wet stones gold after a brief summer rain. He was not waiting, not in the old hungry way. He was only sitting where life had taught him to sit, listening to the hen settle and the wind move through cedar. Near the well, in the soft mud, there were paw prints again. Several, some large, some smaller. He could not know whether any belonged to Juniper's line. Wild families did not keep records for lonely men. They did not return to complete a story. They crossed where water, cover, memory, and instinct allowed. But Amos looked at the prints beside the old well and smiled. One thirsty bobcat had come to him thin, wary, and unwilling to trust. He had offered water, distance, and hands that stayed still. In time, she had brought 9 more shadows to drink beneath the moon. And somehow, by helping them remain wild, Amos Ridley had found his own life returning to him, not all at once, but paw print by paw print after rain. The house grew quiet that night, in the gentle way houses do when nothing is missing from the silence. Amos washed his mug, checked the latch, and paused by the shelf where the dented pan rested upside down. He ran one finger along the bright worn place on its rim, then left it there for morning. Outside, the well stones cooled under starlight. The blue charm moved in the breeze with its small glass note, not loud enough to call anything, only soft enough to belong. Beyond the yard, the cedar line held its secrets. Maybe young bobcats moved there. Maybe only wind passed through. Either way, Amos had learned not to ask the dark for more than it wished to give. Somewhere, the old paths continued. A mother's caution, a youngster's first hunt, a paw testing soft earth before the next step. The world stayed wide, and the wild remained wild, and that was part of the mercy. For anyone still listening, may this little well in the dust stay with you a while. May it remind you that kindness does not always reach out. Sometimes it waits, keeps water clean, fixes the dangerous edges, and lets love choose its own distance. Thank you for staying with Amos, with Juniper, and with the 9 quiet shapes that once gathered under moonlight beside the stones. Rest now with the sound of rain fading from the porch roof, the old charm swaying over the well, and soft paw prints slowly filling with silver light. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.